Hi. Um, we're back to finish off chapter 23 on China and Japan during the 15, 16, and 1700s. As hopefully you remember in the previous lecture or discussion, we talked mainly about China under the Ming and Qing dynasties, focusing especially on political developments and then economic and some social changes as well. Which reminds me, I guess I should repeat the emphasis from last time about the whole chapter is about tradition and change, right? So that to this lecture, like the previous one, we're going to focus on what stays the same, what traditional practices, ideas, culture uh, is in place, and what are the new developments or the changes. So with that, let's jump into the section that in chapter 23 that discusses uh, cultural and intellectual developments in China during this time period. And it's found on page 440 in the textbook, and the heading of the section is the Confucian tradition, there it is, tradition, and new cultural influences. So again, it's telling us that there's this emphasis on tradition, especially Confucian ideas and values, but there are some new developments as well. Um, as you'll recall, the Ming and Qing dynasty both put a heavy emphasis on preserving traditional practices, institutions, values, and at the root of a lot of this is the ideas or teachings of Confucius. Um, or perhaps more accurately, the ideas of Neo Confucianism. Confucius himself lived almost 2,000 years prior to the Ming and Qing dynasty. So, of course, over 2,000 years, a lot of his ideas had been modified, adapted over time. So, the type of Confucianism that was promoted by the Ming and Qing was actually called Neo Confucianism, sort of new Confucianism. And what was new about it was mainly that it incorporated a number of Buddhist uh, ideas, concepts, approaches to the study of nature, the study of the world and human society. So Neo Confucianism is a syncretic phenomenon, right? Remember syncretic from when we talked about uh, developments in Africa. Oh, so Neo Confucianism is a syncretic blend of traditional Confucianism with these elements from the Buddhist tradition or practices. Now, Neo Confucianism itself was actually first developed, formulated back around 1100. Uh, so it's not terribly new itself. It had been around for a couple hundred years, having been developed or formulated by a man named Zhu Xi. And so I think Zhu Xi, Neo Confucianism, they are both key terms. Um, and you can find that on page 440, as we've said. Uh, but that is the basic sort of the official ideology of the Ming and Qing is Neo-Confucianism with the emphasis on hierarchy and these mutual obligations between different members of society. Um, and it stressed again order, stability. Um, that is what the elite, the ruling elite, studied, what the government stressed, and it had a pervasive influence on Chinese culture and society. But and that's mainly something that the upper classes favored and enjoyed. The book talks about what they call popular culture and popular novels, that lower and middle class people had slightly different taste and interest than the upper classes. And As you'll remember, we talked a little bit about some of the economic and social changes that developed as the economy grew. Groups like artisans, craftsmen, merchants became more numerous and often more wealthy and influential, and they supported different types of writing, different types of entertainment activities than the elite. And uh, there are no key terms necessarily related to this, but it's important to remember that even today when we talk about culture, there are different types of culture, sometimes called high and low, or high and popular culture. Of course, sometimes we use the word subcultures to indicate that different groups have different tastes, values, practices. So, Neo-Confucianism is sort of the dominant element in Chinese culture at the time, but there's this undercurrent of a more popular, less intellectual, I guess we could even call it more uh, secular and fun type of culture that attracted especially the interest of the growing middle classes. Um, Besides the popular culture, the book also talks about the influence of Christianity, or at least the presence of Christianity. And here we see Matteo Ricci again. Uh, you'll recall him. He's one of the missionaries who went to China to try and promote Christianity. Um, Attracted some followers, but not terribly many. Uh, but the idea is that this was a new element that was present in China at the time. And even though it wasn't terribly influential, it did cause concern among the uh, upper classes, the rulers of China, because it was seen as sort of foreign, different, a possible threat to this traditional stable order they're trying to create. So the Chinese government did keep a close eye on the Christian missionaries and European visitors, merchants in general. Um, uh, and in the end, the uh, Christian influence actually declined, not so much because of the Chinese government, but there were some squabbles and differences among the Christian missionaries themselves. We don't need to go into all the ins and outs of this, but long story short, uh, the Jesuits, who were the missionary group that Ricci belonged to, they were the most successful of them, but they basically end up being forced to shut down their activities by the Catholic Church, the Pope back in Europe. They say that the Jesuits were going too far in terms of trying to accommodate Chinese tastes and beliefs, that they thought it was getting kind of syncretic, right? Okay, let's look at Japan real quick. Um, the section in the chapter is called Unification of Japan, and there we again we have the main theme laid out for us, that Japan is united under a new government, a new type of government at this time, and this is going to be the basis for uh, uh, a a new, I guess I'm trying to say, a mix of, again, tradition and culture of change in Japan as well. Um, it talks about how uh, this new period is called the Tokugawa era, the Tokugawa shogunate. Um, Shoguns, as the book points out, it was an office title that had been created hundreds of years earlier, and it basically refers to a military governor who ruled uh, Japan in the name of the emperor. There was an emperor in Japan, but the emperors were basically powerless, had no real authority, and occupied their time mainly with ceremonial type of activities in kind of an isolated environment. The real power was in the hands of these military governors, um, who whose power was based on their military power, that they were military strongmen who were able to dominate other military leaders in Japan and kind of claim the title of shogun. But it was always kind of a shifting balance, and various nobles would challenge the shoguns periodically. There's constant sort of warfare between various nobles and shoguns. So it's pretty very chaotic period for hundreds of years in Japan before the Tokugawa. The Tokugawa come along around 1500, and they are able to uh, defeat all their main rivals and stake a claim to power as shogun, and are able to effectively keep the other nobles, who are referred to as daimyo. That's another key term, Daimyo. It's in page 441. Daimyo are these large, powerful nobles who have large estates, often private armies. They have their own kind of systems of justice and money. So they're kind of little tiny kings in their own neighborhood, right? Um, and so the daimyo has subdued those people, kind of eliminated them as rivals to himself, but they're still out there, and the shogun has got to keep an eye on the daimyo, make sure they don't get too strong or pose a threat down the road. So the new Tokugawa shoguns, their first concern is, how do we keep the daimyo under control? And again, there's the heading says control of the daimyo. They do a number of things, but what the book emphasizes is this system of alternate attendance. The alternate attendance system was one of the tools used by the Tokugawa shoguns to limit the power, limit the independence of the daimyo, the powerful nobles. And if you look at it, it's quite a bit like what Louis XIV did in France with the French nobles, having them come to Versailles and live there with him. In Japan, the Tokugawa don't go quite that far, but they have a system where every other year a group of nobles comes to the capital, lives there, and then the next year they go home and another group of nobles comes in, right? So alternate attendance. Every year it's a different group of nobles there in the capital. And the Tokugawa want them in the capital so that they can keep an eye on them. And it's also a way to kind of get the nobles to spend their money and resources on other things besides their own private armies and things. So it's, again, like Louis XIV, this is a way to undermine the local power of the big nobles, a way to keep a close eye on them, and make sure they aren't a threat or challenge to you as daimyo. As shogun, excuse me. The effort at controlling the daimyo is linked to a policy of trying to limit foreign influence and foreign contact. That the Tokugawa shoguns deliberately try to restrict European contacts, European influence, especially so that the local daimyo, the local nobles, cannot hook up with Europeans and kind of do business with each other and somehow pose a threat to the shogun. Again, you can read more about that on page 441, but the idea is that Europeans pose a threat or a possible threat to this new Tokugawa system, especially if they somehow establish contacts with the daimyo. So you try to eliminate that threat by keeping foreigners out as much as possible. The book points out that it's never complete isolation, that the Tokugawa always do allow some outsiders to come and visit Japan, to trade, exchange ideas and stuff. But it's only under very tightly controlled conditions. And especially later on, the Tokugawa insists that it's just the Dutch who are going to be allowed in, and that's just at one particular place in Japan. For reasons we don't need to go into, the Tokugawa felt the Dutch were the least threatening of any European country. Okay, so the Tokugawa unify Japan, more or less. They subdue the daimyo. They create a stable political system. And having created this new stable system, they emphasize tradition, right? They want to preserve and protect this new order they've created. And the way they think they do that best is by emphasizing traditional customs and practices. And again, that's why the foreigners were seen as such a threat, that they were not part of the traditional order. Now, the next section here on Japan talks about economic and social change, right? Here's the change again. Just like in China, the political structure was focused on order, stability, tradition. But the economic order, the social system, was much more flexible, and you found more change there. In particular, just like in China, it talks about population growth. That population growth occurred in Japan as well. Not quite as much as China, but it did occur. And this creates forces of change in terms of growing population leads to economic development, new types of business activities to support the growing population. Again, details here are, not something we have to focus on a lot, but you see the element of dynamism in the economy, creating change and transformation in the social order, the social system. And just like in China, it was merchants and businessmen who tended to flourish and prosper as a result of the economic growth. And of course, merchants and businessmen were not really part of the traditional social order, or they were there, but they had very low status and prestige. And as they grow in number and wealth, they're able to sort of influence and shape culture and other areas of life. And once I find the right page in the chapter, we'll talk about that. Okay, here we are. That this is reflected in the growth of things like what the book calls floating worlds, that merchants, businessmen, artisans, they are found mainly in cities, and there was a huge growth in cities in Japan at the time. And these cities would have entertainment districts, areas where people went to have fun, to be entertained. And that's what they called the floating world. These areas were areas, districts where the normal rules of behavior, the traditional values, the Confucian values did not apply. You could let your hair down. You could do things there that you could not or should not do um, elsewhere, in your daily life. So the floating world represents this uh, type of culture, activities that appeal to the growing merchant and middle classes whose tastes in literature, tastes in art, taste in music, it's different from the more traditional culture and tastes of the upper classes, the daimyo, the shoguns, etc. Um, so again, that the floating world's an example of how things change in terms of culture and society, even though the Tokugawa shoguns are trying to keep a lid on it. You simply cannot stop all change. It's going to happen. Now, last but not least, another area where there's some element of change in culture in Japan at this time is what the book refers to as Dutch learning. We've already mentioned that the Dutch were uh, the one group of Europeans that the Tokugawa kind of felt okay letting into their country, at least to come in and trade on a small scale. Um, and when the Dutch came to trade, they also brought information about uh, intellectual, scientific, technical developments in Europe or other parts of the world. So the Dutch merchants are kind of a way that the Japanese elites can get a sense of what's going on in the broader world, even though they don't want to let that broader world into Japan on a large scale. So they are aware of what's going on in other parts of the world. They have an idea of some of these scientific and technical developments in Europe, but they don't really want to allow those changes, those developments into their country because they see it as a threat to this new stable system they've spent so much time in trying to create. The same is also true for uh, the Christian religion. The book points out that um, the Christians, Christian missionaries went to Japan as well as China. They were able to win a sizable number of converts. I mean, not a huge number, but as a percentage of the population, it was a larger percentage than in China. So the Tokugawa see the growth of Christianity as a danger, right? It's a foreign religion. Um, and these Christians, missionaries, they all report back to the Pope or some other authority in Europe. And again, that makes the Tokugawa uneasy because, again, they see this as a potential challenge to their own authority. So just as they tried to uh, eliminate or control uh, general European influences, they make a particular effort to uh, stop the growth of Christianity, and eventually it leads to a full-scale persecution of Christians, hunting them down, arresting them, putting them in jail, executing them, really serious persecution to stamp this out. And it succeeds to a large degree. I mean, not 100%, but the number of Christians shrinks dramatically because it simply becomes too dangerous. And There's a few people who continue it kind of secretly underground, but it's pretty much no longer a mass movement. It's certainly not anything that the Tokugawa have to fear after the 1600s. So Tokugawa, very similar to the Ming and Qing in terms of their emphasis on tradition, protecting what they see as the old school values, old school practices that made their country great, and uh, trying to limit as much as possible any type of change, especially if it was from a foreign place. But at the same time, remember that Japan is different from China. They both may stress tradition, stability, and order, but if you step back and look at it, that traditional order is a little bit different in the two places. Like we already mentioned, in Japan you have an emperor just like you have an emperor in China, but the emperor in Japan is extremely weak. In Japan, you have what? The shogun, a military governor with the real power. And the daimyo are also largely military type leaders. And who works for the daimyo? Samurai, right? So the military groups are extremely important in Japanese society and exercise a lot of influence. In China, though, if you remember, who was it that was sort of next in line to the emperor? It was the scholar bureaucrats, right? Civilian leaders, civilian officials. Military men in China were kind of looked down upon. So just like everywhere else, think seriously about what do China and Japan have in common? What do they have that are different, right? Because there will be questions on the tests about this. Similarities, differences, patterns, and not just between China and Japan, but between China, Japan, and Africa, or China, Japan, and Europe, right? Always keep in mind this is called world history. So one of the things that we're going to be asking you and looking for is how are all of these areas similar or different, right? Okay, so we're going to wrap this up. Chapter 23 is done. The next couple of video lectures are going to be on chapter 24 on the Islamic empires that arose in the Middle East and South Asia. And so there'll be two of those lectures, and that should carry us through until I get back in town from my professional trip. Bye.